Mirror Talk Episode 29, The Grammar of Grace, Self-Forgiveness and Flow. The language of compassion. Welcome to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system, a place where we speak softly to the parts of ourselves that the world taught us to silence, a place where tone becomes medicine, and words finally remember how to hold us instead of harm us. Today, we take a step into one of the most misunderstood and fiercely guarded territories in human psychology and spirituality. Grace, not as a moral virtue or spiritual prize, but as a physiological event, a nervous system shift, a quiet reorientation toward truth, tenderness, and being able to stay with ourselves after we've broken our own hearts. This is episode 29, The Grammar of Grace, Self-Forgiveness and Flow, and it gently closes the heaviest corridor of layer 3, deep mirrors, the layer of inner narratives, hidden languages, and the emotional architecture we carry from the past into every breath of the present. This episode doesn't teach you how to be forgiven. It teaches you how to stop abandoning yourself long enough to let repair become possible. Grace is often spoken about like a gift bestowed from above, or a rare moment of holiness in an otherwise harsh world. But here in the Mirror Talk universe, we approach it with a different lens, one grounded in neurobiology, linguistics, compassion, and embodied truth. Grace is not abstract. Grace is something your body does. It is the moment your shoulders drop before your mind catches up. The breath you didn't ask for, but came anyway. The quiet pulse of relief when you realize, I don't have to keep punishing myself to stay safe. Grace is the nervous system's way of telling you that survival mode is no longer required. It's the body's first language of forgiveness, a softening, a loosening, an internal unbracing. Long before you think the words I forgive myself, your body begins to undo the knots created by shame, fear, or regret. That softening is not weakness. It is coherence. It is the return of oxygen to places that have been starving for years. But before we go deeper, we need to name a difficult truth. Self-forgiveness is the most intimate confrontation a human can have with themselves. It is not a cognitive skill. It is not a moral exercise. It is a felt sense, a shift in the relationship between your past self, your present self, and the self you are still becoming. Self-forgiveness is not about erasing what happened. It's about repairing the inner relationship that shame tried to destroy. Shame says, I am the mistake. Grace says, I chose while trying to stay safe. The nervous system says neither. It simply reacts. It tightens, contracts, braces, and loops until a new form of truth arrives. Today, that truth is grace. Why we struggle to forgive ourselves, a nervous system view. When we talk about guilt or shame, people often think in moral terms. They think forgiveness requires deservingness, punishment, or redemption. But those frameworks, while culturally powerful, rarely explain why the body resists letting go, even when the mind says, I understand what happened. I want to move forward. The truth is simpler and far more biological. Your nervous system holds on to self-blame because it believes it is safer than self-trust. Self-blame is predictable. It creates structure in uncertainty. It gives the illusion of control. If it was my fault, then I can prevent it next time. Self-forgiveness is unpredictable. It requires vulnerability. It asks you to stop bracing for impact. It invites you into a state of openness that once felt dangerous. From a polyvagal perspective, self-forgiveness often requires ventral vagal re-engagement, characterized by a state of safety, connection, curiosity, and grounded presence. But shame and fear live in dorsal collapse or sympathetic activation, the states of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. In those states, grace feels impossible, even threatening. Your body does not resist self-forgiveness because you are flawed. It resists because survival once depended on tension, vigilance, or self-surveillance. Grace asks you to disarm. Your history may have taught you that disarmament is a dangerous concept. This is why forgiveness is not a decision. It is a transition. Grace happens before you choose it. Many people imagine forgiveness as a heroic mental act, a conscious declaration, a moment of clarity, a shift in belief. But in the nervous system, the timeline is reversed. Grace arrives before the mind understands it. It shows up as release, a muscular exhale, the return of warmth to the hands, a sudden sense of spaciousness under the sternum, a swelling in the chest that feels like relief or grief or both. This is why people often cry when they finally forgive themselves, not because they decided to, but because their body remembered how. Forgiveness is not a thought. It is an autonomic reset, a state change, a physiological door unlocking. And once it opens, the mind can finally follow. The enemy of grace, internalized surveillance grace, is not merely letting go. Grace is letting go of the performance of punishment. Most people don't realize that their self-talk, self-monitoring, self-criticism, and perfectionism serve a hidden purpose: to maintain a sense of safety in relationships, culture, or identity. If punishment was once the price of belonging, then forgiveness threatens connection. This is why so many adults can forgive others easily, but themselves rarely. They are not afraid of forgiveness. They are afraid of what forgiveness might cost them socially, relationally, or spiritually. When love was conditional, when approval required performance, when mistakes meant emotional exile, self-forgiveness becomes disobedience, and the inner critic becomes a loyal servant to the systems that shaped us. Grace breaks that contract, not by fighting the critic, but by revealing that survival no longer depends on internal harm. Living under the microscope, grace in a digital age. The digital world complicates forgiveness even further. We now live in a culture where mistakes are archived, memories resurface without consent, the past is searchable, and shame can go viral. Self-forgiveness becomes difficult because the digital mirror does not forget, and increasingly, it does not allow you to forget either. Every past version of you, every post, every caption, every impulsive opinion can be brought back to the surface, feeding the nervous system with old signals of threat. This creates a constant low-level background hum of vigilance. What did I say? Who did I offend? Who saw me? Who remembers? Grace cannot thrive in hypervisibility. Grace needs room. Grace needs imperfection. Grace needs privacy, even if only internally. We will work with this later in the digital mirror of element 1. But for now, let this land gently. Self-forgiveness is not a luxury in a digital age. It is a necessity for survival. Without it, the nervous system becomes trapped in permanent performance loops, where the past is always watching, and the self is always bracing. Forgiveness versus permission, a necessary distinction. One of the biggest confusions in self-forgiveness work is the conflation between self-forgiveness and self-permission. Self-forgiveness is about repair. Self-permission is about boundaries, autonomy, and sometimes self-indulgence. They are not the same. Self-permission says, I can do what I want. Self-forgiveness says, I understand why I did what I did, and I no longer need to punish myself for it. Confusing the two is why people fear self-forgiveness. They fear it will erase accountability or enable harmful behavior. But real grace always leads to greater coherence, not less. It dissolves shame, not responsibility. It restores presence, which restores clarity, which restores choice. If shame was the cage, forgiveness is the hinge. It lets the door move again. Grace as flow. When self-surveillance fades, flow states, the moments where you lose track of time, where action and awareness merge, where the mind stops narrating and starts participating, are some of the purest forms of grace. Flow dissolves the inner critic. Flow suspends self-monitoring. Flow returns you to a pre-judgment state of self-trust. This is why movement practices, art, sport, breathwork, and even long conversations with people we feel deeply safe with can evoke forgiveness without any explicit intention. Flow is the nervous system's way of showing us, see, you are more than your mistakes. See, you can move without breaking anything. See, you are still capable of joy without earning it. Flow is grace in action. Flow is forgiveness without words. Flow is the body remembering how to be unburdened. Why grace matters now more than ever. Because we live in a world of constant comparison, constant feedback, constant performance, constant self-surveillance, constant proof of goodness, and constant pressure to demonstrate that we are improving, correcting, evolving, and deserving of approval. Grace is the antidote to this world. Grace is the nervous system's rebellion against perfectionism. Grace is a refusal to negotiate your right to exist. Without grace, healing becomes another form of labor. Without grace, inner work becomes self-punishment in disguise. Without grace, forgiveness becomes another performance of worthiness. Grace interrupts the cycle. Grace returns us to breath. Grace restores the relationship with the self. Before we move on, a reflection to prepare the ground. Gently ask yourself, when does my body soften without permission? Not when you think you should relax. Not when you decide to. Not when you meditate, journal, or intentionally practice release, but when it happens by itself, spontaneously, unplanned, unauthorized by your inner critic. That moment, subtle, fleeting, honest, is where grace begins. Hold that in your hands for now. We're about to take the first step deeper, and so we arrive at the threshold of the first element. To understand how forgiveness works, not in theory, not in morality, but in the biology of breath and bone, we must begin where all healing begins, the nervous system, because before you forgive yourself, your body forgives you first. Grace is often framed as a spiritual idea, a moral virtue, or a psychological skill. But before it becomes any of those things, grace is a physiological event. Something shifts inside the body. Something softens. Something unclenches. Something long held finally loosens its grip. Before grace is understood in the mind, it is felt in the tissues. Human beings experience forgiveness as a nervous system phenomenon, long before the story catches up. The brain may still be analyzing, criticizing, replaying, and reviewing, but the body, in its own ancient intelligence, knows when the threat has passed. And it knows when it hasn't. This is where we begin. Not with morality, not with philosophy, not with emotional narratives, but with biological reality. Because you cannot practice self-forgiveness with language that contradicts the state of your nervous system. And you cannot force grace into a body still trapped in survival. Grace requires safety. Forgiveness requires coherence. Compassion requires a regulated internal rhythm. Everything else is performance. The polyvagal science of release, according to polyvagal theory, emotional shifts don't begin in the thinking brain. They begin in the autonomic one. Forgiveness is no exception. When you forgive yourself, you aren't just rewriting a memory, you are reorganizing your physiological state. Grace, in polyvagal terms, is the movement from defensive physiology back into ventral vagal engagement, the zone of openness, groundedness, connection, and self-recognition. Most people think shame is a psychological burden, but biologically, shame is a dorsal vagal freeze pattern layered with sympathetic activation, a collapse mixed with inner turbulence. The body withdraws, the breath shortens, the voice dampens, and the sense of self becomes fuzzy or fragmented. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, reverses some of this. It doesn't erase what happened. It resets how the nervous system relates to it. The body begins to orient again. The breath deepens without instruction. The throat loosens enough for sound to return. The mind's grip around the event softens by degrees. Grace is not an emotion. Grace is the return of physiological safety, and this return is not metaphorical, it is measurable. Studies from 2010-2023 show that self-forgiveness practices correlate with increased vagal tone, reduced cortisol output, lowered amygdala activation, and improved interoceptive accuracy, the ability to sense internal states. The brain's networks associated with self-relevance and self-evaluation quieten, making room for warmth to emerge. Grace doesn't just lift shame. Grace disables its survival loop. Why grace begins in the body, not the story. The story of shame, what you think you did wrong, how you replay it, who you imagine judging you, is almost always an aftershock of the physiological state you're in. If the body is in defense, the story will sound like punishment. If the body is in collapse, the story will sound like unworthiness. If the body is in threat perception, the story will sound irreversible. But when the body re-enters ventral safety, even briefly, the narrative changes. Suddenly, I ruined everything becomes I reacted from a place of fear. I was stupid becomes I didn't have the capacity I thought I had. I should have known better becomes I understand why I acted that way. Notice how these rewrites aren't excuses. They're contextualizations. They recognize complexity. They honor nervous system reality. The shift from self-attack to self-recognition doesn't come from forcing compassion. It comes from altering the state from which your inner narrator speaks. This is why self-forgiveness isn't a moral decision. It's a biological one. Until the body feels safe, the mind is not allowed to stop punishing you. Because punishment, for the dysregulated nervous system, feels like control. And control, for the frightened nervous system, feels like safety. Forgiveness threatens the survival illusion. If I let myself off the hook, won't I make the same mistake again? If I soften, won't that mean I approve of what I did? If I stop punishing myself, who will keep me accountable? From the outside, these questions sound dramatic. Inside the body, they are survival logic. Grace is terrifying to anyone whose nervous system learned that softness is unsafe. The difference between self-forgiveness and self-permission. One of the most misunderstood distinctions in psychological and spiritual work is the difference between forgiveness and permission. Forgiveness is recognizing the nervous system conditions that shaped your behavior. Permission is endorsing or repeating the behavior. They are not the same. Forgiveness says, I see the frightened moment you were in. Permission says, I'm allowed to do it again. Most people resist self-forgiveness because they confuse it with permission, but they are opposite states. Forgiveness reduces the likelihood of repetition because you're no longer acting out of shame-laced survival patterns. Permission without accountability increases it. Grace creates responsibility, not passivity. A regulated body evaluates its own actions with clarity, not self-abandonment. It recognizes where misalignment occurred and restores coherence from the inside out. Forgiveness is a movement toward alignment. Permission without reflection is a movement away from it. Once you internalize that forgiveness is not moral laziness but nervous system regulation, the entire terrain of self-growth changes. You stop trying to intellectually fix your mistakes. You begin regulating the physiology that produced them. And from there, new behavior emerges naturally. Flow states. When self-forgiveness becomes fluidity, flow states are often discussed through creativity, sport, or deep skill development. But flow is also a profound expression of self-forgiveness. When you enter flow, the inner critic temporarily dissolves. Self-surveillance drops. Shame loosens its grip on the frontal cortex. The mind and body resynchronize. There is no conflict between intention and action. Flow is what happens when the nervous system stops interrupting itself. Self-forgiveness is what enables flow. A dysregulated body cannot enter flow. It is too busy scanning for threat, replaying the past, or predicting future harm. Grace brings you into coherence long enough for the brain to stop dividing itself against itself. Flow is neurological harmony. Shame is neurological fragmentation. Forgiveness is what bridges the two. When the body softens, stomach unclenching, throat opening, jaw relaxing, breath deepening, the possibility of creative or relational flow increases dramatically. Grace is not just a soft emotion. Grace is an altered mode of perception. It quiets the survival narrative so you can experience reality without filtering it through punishment. The body is evidence. What softening really means, most people misunderstand what it means for the body to soften. They think it means relaxation or letting go or dropping into calm. But softening is subtler and more profound. Softening is the loosening of defensive contraction. It's the moment the body stops bracing. It's when the shoulders release without effort. It's when the sigh escapes without intention. It's when the stomach stops gripping the past. It's when the jaw unlocks from rehearsed regret. Softening is truth returning, because threat creates tension, and forgiveness dissolves the threat. Self-forgiveness is not mental absolution. It is the disarmament of the autonomic system. When you understand this, grace becomes accessible, not because the story changes, but because the physiology through which you hear the story shifts. Digital mirror, grace in the age of hypervisibility. It is almost impossible to talk about self-forgiveness today without addressing the digital dimension, where the past is archived, searchable, screenshotable, and perpetual. Online, mistakes don't age, regrettable moments don't fade, growth doesn't overwrite earlier versions. Every old post, message, comment, or tagged photo becomes a fossilized version of you, preserved as if the nervous system that created it still exists. This makes self-forgiveness harder, not because the mistake is worse, but because the mirror is endless. Hypervisibility creates constant self-monitoring, anticipatory shame, fear of misinterpretation, internalized audience gaze, chronic sympathetic activation. The nervous system cannot soften when it believes it is being watched. And the internet is built on the illusion of constant witnessing. This leads to digital shame cycles. 1. Overexposure leads to posting too openly when dysregulated. 2. Self-revision leads to deleting, editing, and curating. 3. Self-surveillance leads to watching yourself. 4. Self-punishment leads to criticizing your digital past. 5. Self-silencing leads to withdrawing to prevent further shame. 6. Identity fragmentation leads to multiple online selves, inhibiting coherence. Forgiveness becomes nearly impossible when you're living 3 steps removed from your own nervous system. Grace today requires resisting the digital gaze, not because privacy is a virtue, but because your body cannot release shame when it feels performative. To forgive yourself, you must learn to step out of the archive, even if the archive remembers you forever. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is deactivating the threat memory inside the body. Reflection prompt. When does my body soften without permission? When no one is watching? When I breathe slower than the story wants me to? When does the self-criticism script get tired? When I stop telling myself I must earn rest? When am I no longer rehearsing my defense? Listen to that softening. It is grace in its raw biological form. Grace is not a single moment. It is a physiological sequence, a slow unwinding, a re-entry to the present after being exiled inside your own self-judgment. And because the nervous system moves in spirals, not straight lines, grace rarely arrives in a direct path. It comes in surges. It comes in pockets. It comes in breaths you didn't know you were holding. It comes in pauses where the body stops defending itself. It comes in micro movements that the mind barely registers. If shame is contraction, then grace is reclamation. The slow reversal of shame physiology. Shame is often described as heaviness, heat, shrinking, or sinking, but biologically, it is the collapse of ventral coherence. It interrupts your sense of I am and replaces it with I shouldn't be, I'm too much, or I failed. Forgiveness, then, is not the opposite of shame. Forgiveness is the unwinding of shame. A few key physiological signatures mark the movement into grace. 1. Breath begins to flow instead of stutter. Shame breath is shallow, top-heavy, and guarded. Forgiveness breath moves lower into the diaphragm. It stops asking permission. 2. Interoception reawakened. During shame, the body goes numb to protect you from feeling too much. During forgiveness, sensation returns, warmth in the chest, tingling in the face, a small internal glow of okayness. 3. Orientation returns. Instead of folding inward, your gaze lifts, your posture opens slightly. The body becomes willing to exist again. 4. The inner narrator changes timbre, not tone in metaphors, literal tone. Neuroscientifically, self-talk shifts frequencies when ventral circuits re-engage. It goes from sharp to steady, from compressed to spacious, from punishment to coherence. Grace is what happens when the body stops telling the mind it deserves to be harmed. Why self-forgiveness feels physically dangerous for some people. For people raised in environments where softness was unpredictable, affection mixed with withdrawal, validation mixed with punishment, safety mixed with threat, forgiveness can feel physiologically unsafe. Grace invites vulnerability, but vulnerability in the past may have led to harm. This creates a paradox. The body longs to soften but fears the consequences of softening. And so, the shoulders try to release but tense again, the breath deepens, then catches, warmth rises, then collapses into numbness. A forgiving thought appears, then is overridden by self-attack. This isn't failure, it's a survival reflex. The nervous system is trying to protect you from repeating the past. Forgiveness requires reteaching the body that openness is safe now, even if it wasn't then. This is a slow, non-linear somatic apprenticeship. Not a decision, not a mantra, not a mindset shift, a rewiring. Forgiveness as nervous system reparenting. Self-forgiveness is a form of internal caregiving, not in the sentimental sense, but in the biological one. When you forgive yourself, you are giving your nervous system safety instead of threat, comprehension instead of criticism, presence instead of abandonment, context instead of condemnation, warmth instead of fear. This is the same medicine children need from caregivers, but delivered internally, as an act of adult sovereignty. Grace is self-reparenting at the level of vagal tone. You are not letting yourself off the hook. You are letting your body out of the cage. The cage was shameful. The key is compassion. The opening is breath and understanding. The somatic signature of enough people often think forgiveness comes when they've done enough healing, apologizing, reflecting, or making up for the past. But research on self-compassion, Kristin Neff, Paul Gilbert, Tanya Singer, suggests something different. Forgiveness lands the moment the nervous system stops believing it must prove its right to exist. Not when the cognitive inventory is complete, not when others approve, not when the moral score is balanced. It arrives when the body says, I don't have to keep punishing myself to feel safe. This sentence, sometimes felt long before articulated, is the hinge of healing. It activates ventral pathways associated with connection and shuts down sympathetic drive associated with self-surveillance. Forgiveness feels like permission to belong to yourself again. Self-forgiveness as an act of autonomic sovereignty. At its core, grace is sovereignty over your own internal climate. Shame is outsourced regulation. You are only allowed to feel safe when you have earned it. Forgiveness is reclaimed regulation. I can create safety inside my own physiology. This shift is radical. It transforms healing from compliance into authorship. Because when you forgive yourself, you stop living under the emotional jurisdiction of past experiences, past beliefs, past authority figures, and past mistakes. You return to internal governance. You reclaim your nervous system from old conditions. You become the one who decides what safety feels like now. Forgiveness is not approval. Forgiveness is emancipation. Digital mirror compassion, in a culture that punishes imperfection, self-forgiveness is harder now than at any point in history, because we are living inside the most unforgiving social experiment ever designed, a world where the past never disappears. The digital self is archived indefinitely, and the digital audience never sleeps. You can be doing beautifully in your body, breathing deeper, feeling safer, softening naturally, and then accidentally scroll into an old photo, old post, old mistake, old version of yourself. Instantly, the body contracts, the breath tightens, the old shame script reactivates, the nervous system replays a threat that no longer exists. This is digital time travel trauma. Your body is forced to re-experience past states without consent. Forgiveness becomes almost impossible when the abuser re-injures you daily. This is why grace in the digital age is not just emotional work. It is boundary work, attention work, and nervous system protection. Compassion becomes an act of resistance, because the world trains you to perform, perfect, and purify, not to soften. And self-forgiveness requires the softness the world punishes. Everything we have explored so far brings us to a pivotal realization. Grace is not only felt in the body, it must also be spoken into being. The nervous system shifts first, yes, but the language you use afterwards determines whether the shift stabilizes or collapses. Your tone can reinforce grace or resurrect shame. Your syntax can create permission to heal or replicate old punishment. The words you choose, and the way you choose them, either reopen the wound or close the feedback loop of self-attack forever. To forgive yourself, you must learn to speak a new grammar, one that recognizes your humanity, your nervous system, your complexity, and your evolution. Because the body begins forgiveness, but the language you use determines whether it lasts. Now we move into Element 2, the linguistics of self-forgiveness, tone, syntax, and inner repair. Self-forgiveness does not begin as an idea. It begins as a tone. When you listen closely to the nervous system, you notice something subtle. The body responds to how you speak long before it reacts to what you say. This is a core principle of the Mirror-Linguistic Hypothesis, MLH, and why self-forgiveness always fails when we try to intellectualize it. A sentence like, I know I should forgive myself, sounds rational, but its tone often carries tension, impatience, or implied threat. It feels like an audit, not a release. The nervous system hears not an apology, but an ultimatum. This is why MLH frames self-forgiveness as a linguistic transition, not a moral achievement. You are not trying to become a better person. You are trying to speak to yourself in a way that stops activating survival states. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion notes that tenderness is not a personality trait. It is a physiological event. The body has to recognize safety before forgiveness can even register as an option. Tone is the messenger of that safety, the tone shift that starts forgiveness. Many people attempt self-forgiveness through cognitive reframing. I didn't mean to, I'll try harder, or I'll do better next time. These phrases often carry a soft veneer, but their underlying structure is self-rejection. They imply that the past self was defective, the current self is on probation, and the future self must earn its place. This is not grace, it is linguistic surveillance. Forgiveness begins with tone, because tone is the first signal the vagus nerve recognizes. The nervous system doesn't decode complex narratives. It scans for threat in cadence, rhythm, breath, and vocal warmth. A gentle tone, even when paired with incomplete words, can downshift a shame-activated system. A harsh tone, despite sophisticated language, intensifies the sense of internal danger. This is why a single exhale with softened edges can be more healing than an entire monologue of self-explanations. When people say, I'm trying to forgive myself, what they usually mean is, I'm trying to earn my way back into my own approval. But tone reveals the truth. The effort is laced with fear. Fear of repeated failure, fear of being judged, and fear that softness will make them irresponsible. Fear has a voice, and it sounds tight around the throat. Self-forgiveness only becomes possible when the tone shifts from surveillance to support. The syntax of grace. The second dimension of linguistic self-forgiveness is syntax, the structure of the sentences we use to narrate our mistakes. Syntax is not neutral. It determines whether language constricts or liberates the nervous system. When someone says, I should have known better, The syntax chains the speaker to a past moment, implying they had access to information that only hindsight provides. This is a linguistic distortion, and the nervous system interprets it as failure. The body tenses, breath shortens, posture collapses, a physiological mirror of the sentence's emotional logic. Compare this to the syntax shift MLH advocates. I understand why I did that. This is not an excuse. It is a recognition that the previous self acted from its available state, its stress load, its history, its beliefs, its fears, its blind spots. The syntax reframes past behavior through context rather than condemnation. Understanding is not justification, it is integration. And integration is what dissolves internal exile. Forgiveness lives in syntax because syntax determines whether you are a character being punished by the narrative or the narrator reclaiming authorship of the story. Language patterns that keep you unforgiven. Unforgiveness is not a feeling, it is a linguistic ecosystem. Most people live inside a self-talk loop that linguistically replays the moment they regret, pulling the body back into the original emotional charge. Neuroscientists such as Lisa Feldman Barrett note that the brain relies heavily on predictive modeling, and it creates emotional states based on the language you use to describe your world. When a mistake is repeatedly narrated with phrases like, "I always ruin things," the brain predicts future failure and primes the nervous system accordingly. Certain phrases act like emotional time machines. Absolute statements, "I never learn, I always do this," prevent growth by framing behavior as identity. Moralizing statements, "That was unforgivable, I should be ashamed," collapse complexity into condemnation. Catastrophic syntax, "Everything is ruined, there's no coming back from this," floods the nervous system with false permanence. Inherited scripts, "You made your bed, now lie in it," carry the tone of parental judgment long after childhood ends. These phrases are not merely unhelpful, they physiologically anchor shame. They keep self-forgiveness impossible because the grammar itself is hostile. How self-talk creates or dissolves internal exile. Shame creates internal borders. Parts of the self become exiled, the part that made a mistake, the part that panicked, the part that acted out of old pain. Self-forgiveness is not about absolving those parts. It is about inviting them home. This is why MLH frames self-forgiveness as a linguistic act of reintegration. When your inner syntax shifts from, "Why did you do that?" to, "Of course you reacted that way. Look at what you were carrying," the nervous system hears. You are allowed to return. Shame isolates, forgiveness reattaches. This process depends on the nervous system's ability to recognize safety in the speaker, which in this case is you. Tone is the invitation. Syntax is the doorway. Self-forgiveness walks through when the body feels permitted to soften. The digital mirror. The archive of the unforgiven self-online spaces complicates self-forgiveness because the digital world acts as a permanent archive. Mistakes are stored, searchable, and resurfaceable. A memory from years ago appears, and the nervous system reacts as if the event is happening again. The platform's logic turns old selves into ghosts that haunt the current self. Scrolling through your past posts, messages, or decisions can activate a shame state instantly. The body remembers emotion faster than the mind remembers context. Even neutral content, an old photo, a past version of your opinions, can provoke internal criticism because it collides with who you are now. Digital environments also reinforce self-surveillance. The awareness of being observed or potentially observed influences tone, language, and posture. Grace becomes harder when you are performing, especially for an invisible audience. This is why the Mirror-Linguistic Hypothesis, MLH, proposes the practice of digital amnesty. Choosing not to relive catastrophized memories algorithmically, it is an act of nervous system sovereignty. You choose where the archive ends and where the present begins. Rewriting online language, editing bios, captions, or old posts to match your current tone is not vanity. It is neural coherence. Narrative realignment. The body relaxes when its digital mirror stops contradicting its internal evolution. Once you begin to understand that tone and syntax form the architecture of self-forgiveness, the next layer becomes unmistakable. The internal sentences that keep you trapped in past versions of yourself. These sentences are not accidental. They are inherited, rehearsed, socially reinforced, and often algorithmically amplified. The nervous system does not cling to the past because it prefers suffering. It clings to the past because the grammar of suffering is familiar, the sentence that keeps you unforgiven. Almost everyone has one core sentence that blocks forgiveness, a syntactic knot that tightens every time shame rises. Sometimes it is obvious, "I don't deserve to move on." Sometimes it's more subtle, "I should have known better." Sometimes it's entirely unconscious, a posture, a tightening of the jaw, a micro-pause in breath that says, "You're still on trial." This sentence is rarely self-created. It is usually the echo of an earlier authority, a parent, teacher, religious voice, cultural script, interpersonal humiliation, or digital environment. MLH identifies this phenomenon as borrowed judgment syntax, when the nervous system internalizes a moral tone that originally belonged to someone else. The body then uses this tone as the default narrator whenever self-forgiveness is attempted. The key to linguistic self-repair is recognizing that this sentence is not true. It is a habit. It is a neural rut carved through repetition, not revelation. Why the nervous system resists self-forgiveness is often framed as a willpower issue. But from a physiological perspective, it is a threat detection issue. The nervous system has a primitive logic. If punishment kept you safe in childhood, softness now feels dangerous. This is why tone matters. When you say, "I forgive myself," but your body is braced, breath shallow, and voice sharp, the nervous system interprets the phrase as another form of control, not relief, coercion. Self-forgiveness becomes possible only when the nervous system perceives no impending threat. This requires a tone that signals, "You're not in trouble. I'm not abandoning you. You no longer need to hide." When tone shifts, the vagus nerve shifts, and when the vagus nerve shifts, forgiveness stops being a cognitive task and becomes a physiological event. An exhale that releases the body from accusation. The difference between emotional permission and linguistic permission. A person who cannot forgive themselves often thinks they lack the emotional maturity to do so. In reality, they lack linguistic permission, the ability to phrase their experience in a way the nervous system recognizes as safe. Emotional permission says, "It's okay that I feel guilty." Linguistic permission says, "I understand why I made that choice given what I knew and what I felt at the time." These are not the same. The first acknowledges emotion. The second restores context. Context is the antidote to shame. Shame collapses complexity. Grace expands it. When syntax expands, breath expands. When breath expands, the body returns from exile. The repair power of revoicing the past. One of the most effective tools in MLH is revoicing, speaking to your past self in the tone they needed at the time of the mistake. This is not reparenting in the pop psychological sense. This is relanguaging the moment that produced the shame loop. The past self is not an enemy. It is a version of you who was trying to navigate life without the information you have now. When you revoice the moment with a tone of understanding, the nervous system receives a new signal. This story does not need to remain a threat. Examples of revoicing. Instead of "I ruined everything," rewrite as "I overwhelmed myself, and I can understand why." Instead of "I can't believe I did that," rewrite as "Of course I reacted that way. I was scared and didn't have better options." Instead of "I failed," rewrite as "I reached my limit." That's not failure, that's information. Notice how none of these sentences excuse behavior. They contextualize it. Context is the linguistic doorway through which self-forgiveness quietly walks. Why the body softens when language softens. It might seem strange that a change in syntax can create a change in physiology, but the relationship is deeply established in neuroscience. Predictive coding models show that the brain treats internal language as sensory input. When the inner voice speaks with gentleness, the nervous system receives a cue of safety. This downregulates hypervigilance, allowing the body to step out of the threat posture that shame creates. This is why forgiveness feels physical. The shoulders drop, the breath deepens, the stomach unclenches, the throat opens. These are not metaphors. They are somatic confirmations that the internal narrative has shifted from punishment to permission. Self-forgiveness is not an internal moral revolution. It is a repatterning of breath, tone, and linguistic prediction. Digital amnesty as nervous system grace. The digital world makes forgiveness harder because it immortalizes the past, but it also offers a unique opportunity for linguistic self-repair. Digital amnesty. Digital amnesty is not deleting history because you're ashamed. It is deleting or consciously reframing digital remnants that keep your nervous system stuck in outdated shame identities. For instance, updating an old bio because it no longer reflects your truth. Archiving posts that reactivate shame you've already metabolized. Rewrite captions in a tone that aligns with your current vocabulary of compassion. Muting memories that algorithmically drag you backwards into timelines you've outgrown. This is not self-curation. This is self-coherence. Your inner linguistics and your digital linguistics must eventually match for the nervous system to feel safe. When your online self becomes a museum of past pain, self-forgiveness becomes neurologically harder. When your online voice evolves with you, forgiveness becomes linguistically possible. The doorway to Element 3 Element 2 shows that self-forgiveness begins in tone, expands through syntax, and integrates through linguistic permission. But this opens a deeper question, not just how we forgive ourselves, but why the nervous system resists that forgiveness in the first place. The next element goes beneath language and into physiology, into the neural architecture of compassion, into the reason punishment feels familiar and grace feels foreign. This is where self-forgiveness stops being a linguistic practice and becomes a psychological phenomenon. The way safety travels through the brain, the way empathy reshapes neural pathways, and the way the body learns to trust itself again. Element 3, psychological insight. The physics of self-compassion. Self-compassion is often described as a soft skill, a moral virtue, or a matter of emotional maturity. But beneath every story, beneath every spiritual teaching, beneath every psychological framework lies something far more elemental. Self-compassion is a physiological event, a shift inside the body, a measurable change in the brain, the breath, and the autonomic nervous system, a physical reorganization of the self away from punishment and towards safety. This element explores that shift not as a metaphor, but as a biological mechanism. Because grace, when understood properly, is not merely something you feel, it is something your entire organism does. The body as the first witness of grace. Before you ever forgive yourself cognitively, Your body registers whether forgiveness is safe. Self-compassion requires the nervous system to move out of a defensive state and into a receptive one. Polyvagal theory demonstrates that ventral vagal activation, the state associated with safety, connection, and social engagement, is the physiological foundation for compassion. Without this state, compassion becomes a concept rather than an experience. This is why so many people say, "I know I should be kinder to myself," but it doesn't land. It doesn't land because the nervous system is still in threat mode. A threat state says fix it, control it, hide it, punish it. Compassion says stay, soften, look, allow. These two modes cannot operate simultaneously. For compassion to arise, the defensive neural circuits must loosen their grip. And that loosening isn't a choice, it's a physiological recalibration. This is the heart of the physics of self-compassion. It requires a shift in autonomic energy from contraction to expansion, from surveillance to presence. The body must first recognize, I am not in danger. Only then can the mind whisper, I'm allowed to be. Why the brain resists self-forgiveness. We as human beings are not naturally punitive. We are naturally protective. The brain resists self-forgiveness, not because you are flawed, but because of predictive coding, the system through which the brain uses experience to anticipate future danger. If self-criticism once kept you safe, by preventing conflict, by avoiding punishment, by maintaining belonging, then the brain tags self-criticism as a survival tool. Forgiveness then appears as a biological risk. Predictive coding bias means the brain trusts the familiar more than the beneficial. Punishment may feel awful, but it is familiar. Grace may feel soothing, but it is unfamiliar. This is why compassion can feel physically uncomfortable. It is why tenderness can trigger panic. It is why you might recoil from kindness directed toward yourself. The organism is not fighting compassion itself. It is fighting unfamiliar safety. Anything unfamiliar, even gentleness, can register as a threat. This is the paradox at the center of self-compassion neuroscience. Self-forgiveness requires safety, but safety itself may feel unsafe if you've lived your life in self-surveillance. The insula, the brain's compass of self-knowing modern neuroscience, has located a key region involved in compassion. The insula, the brain's hub of interoception, the ability to sense internal states. The insula is activated when we recognize our own emotions, empathize with others, detect subtle emotional shifts, process regret, guilt, or shame, register physical sensations linked to emotion. Self-compassion emerges when the insula integrates emotional awareness with a sense of safety. Without ventral vagal support, the insula misinterprets internal sensations as danger. Shame, therefore, becomes a miscategorized experience. The body says unsafe, and the brain labels the self as the threat. But when safety returns, the insula reinterprets emotion differently. It says this is discomfort, not danger. This is emotion, not identity. This shift is the beginning of grace. Grace is the moment the insula stops perceiving your flaws as threats to your survival. Why punishment feels safer than forgiveness. To the traumatized nervous system, punishment feels structured, predictable, contained. Familiar. Forgiveness feels open, fluid, uncontained. And anything uncontained can feel like a loss of control. This is the physics of it. Punishment contracts the body. Forgiveness expands it. Contraction is stabilization. Expansion is a risk. If expansion once resulted in rejection, humiliation, abandonment, or danger, the brain associates openness with threat. So when compassion arises, the nervous system responds as if something is wrong, even when something is healing. Many people mistake this discomfort for proof that they don't deserve forgiveness. But discomfort is simply the body learning a new physics. Expansion is supposed to feel strange. You are stepping into emotional gravity that your nervous system has never allowed before, the violence of self-surveillance. One of the least understood barriers to compassion is chronic self-monitoring, the internal gaze that never softens, never pauses, never forgives. This internal surveillance is not a psychological quirk, but a survival adaptation. If hypervigilance protected you, socially, emotionally, or physically, your brain continues to use it long after the threat has passed. Self-surveillance creates a closed system of energy. You observe yourself. You judge what you observe. You punish what you judge. You anticipate further punishment. You observe that anticipation. Self-forgiveness breaks this loop. Not by overpowering it, but by shifting the internal stance from surveillance to support. Self-surveillance says, where am I wrong? Self-compassion says, where am I hurting? And the physics of punishment collapse instantly when the internal witness switches roles. Mirror neurons and self-compassion. How the brain borrows safety. Self-forgiveness is not only an internal event. It is relational. Mirror neurons, the brain cells involved in empathy, imitation, and social learning, respond to both external and internal signals of compassion. When you speak to yourself in a kinder tone, your mirror neuron system reacts as if someone else is speaking to you kindly. This is what makes grace so powerful. You become both giver and receiver, both healer and healed, both witness and witnessed. This dual activation is why a gentle tone is more transformative than a positive affirmation. A compassionate breath is more effective than a motivational speech. A softened gaze at yourself in the mirror can produce immediate physiological change. You are not imagining it. You are experiencing the biological architecture of compassion, a self-to-self resonance that rewrites threat perception. Why trauma logic fears compassion. Trauma logic is the nervous system's attempt to predict pain before it happens. It is not rational, it is protective. Trauma logic believes if you soften, you will be hurt. If you forgive yourself, you will repeat the mistake. If you loosen control, everything will collapse. If you stop punishing yourself, you will become unsafe. This is the physics of fear. It confuses vigilance, survival. But compassion does not eliminate awareness. It refines it. It reorganizes your internal physics around expansion rather than contraction. Trauma logic says, self-forgiveness will make me reckless. Neuroscience says, self-forgiveness restores cognitive clarity. Your brain is sharper when not under threat. Your decisions are wiser when not driven by fear. Your behavior is more ethical when not distorted by shame. Compassion does not make you softer in the sense of fragility. It makes you softer in the sense of accuracy, the gateway to flow. When self-forgiveness releases self-surveillance, flow states, contrary to popular belief, are not about productivity. They are about the moment the nervous system stops monitoring itself. Flow is reduced self-surveillance, increased sensory integration, reduced fear-based prediction, increased neural coherence. Self-forgiveness is one of the fastest ways to enter flow because it removes the internal punitive observer. When the self is no longer viewed as a threat, the mind stops scanning for danger. Energy once spent on self-judgment becomes available for creativity, presence, emotional intelligence, and complex problem-solving. Flow, then, is not simply a cognitive achievement. It is the nervous system's natural state once shame is released. Grace is not merely the end of punishment. Grace is the restoration of flow. In the first part of this element, we explored the physiology, neuroscience, and internal architecture of compassion. The next section goes deeper into the emotional topography of fear, the subconscious resistance to softness, and the precise neural mechanisms that make forgiveness feel dangerous. Then we'll build the bridge into element 4, the somatic practice of letting go, where grace moves from theory into the body itself. When the nervous system tries to forgive, but the mind keeps score. In the first half of this element, we explored why the brain struggles to release self-blame. In this second half, we discuss how that struggle feels inside the body, and why compassion is less a moral achievement and more a physiological recalibration. Most people imagine forgiveness as a cognitive event. I understand why I did it, therefore I should be free from it. But the nervous system does not operate on understanding. It operates on evidence of safety. And when you've lived years or decades in environments where mistakes were punished, or emotions were minimized, or needs were never allowed to take up space, your body carries a simple predictive rule. If something goes wrong, it must be my fault. If it's my fault, I must make myself smaller to survive. This rule becomes a reflex, fast, automatic, and unquestioned. That's why even when the mind knows self-forgiveness is possible, the body still behaves as though self-forgiveness is a threat. To the body, shame isn't moral guilt. It's a survival adaptation. Letting go feels dangerous because it disrupts a long-standing contract. If I'm hard on myself, maybe others won't have to be. If I punish myself first, maybe I won't be abandoned. If I stay ashamed, maybe I'll stay acceptable. Self-compassion breaks the contract, and therefore risks the world collapsing. This is the physics of grace. One system trying to release, while another system believes release equals death. The conflict is real, biological, predictable, and solvable. The two streams of awareness, compassion versus shame inside every person, especially those with trauma history. There are two competing streams of perception. One, the shame stream, hypervigilant, fast, predictive, and rooted in threat perception. It anticipates danger and preemptively blames the self to maintain control. Its language sounds like, you should have known better. This is your fault. Don't let it happen again. This is the body's error prevention system. 2. The compassion stream, slow, parasympathetic, relational, and rooted in connection. Its language sounds like, I understand why this happened. You did what you could with what you knew. You get to try again. This is the body's repair system. Most people think compassion must overpower shame, but that's not how the nervous system works. It doesn't obey hierarchy. It obeys coherence. Whichever stream is more consistent, more familiar, and more repeatedly reinforced becomes the default. If shame has been rehearsed for years and compassion has been practiced for a few minutes, the outcome is predictable. Shame wins, not because it is more powerful, but because it is more trained. Self-forgiveness requires rehearsing compassion at the level that shame has been rehearsed. That's the true psychological and physiological demand. Forgiveness as energetics. The body balances the equation. There is a physics to emotional processes, forces, equalities, inertia, and momentum. Self-blame carries its own inertia. Rigid shoulders, tight breath, collapsed sternum, downward gaze, shallow vagal tone, heightened prediction error, depleted interoception, closed auditory field. Self-compassion introduces a counterforce, but one that feels unfamiliar, delicate, even wrong. This is why forgiveness often feels like weakness, delusion, irresponsibility, ego, avoidance, when in reality, compassion is the only state capable of restoring regulated breath, returning access to executive function, re-establishing social engagement, improving error correction without collapse, rebalancing autonomic energy, making future harm less likely, not more. Shame cannot produce these outcomes. Shame only prevents. Compassion restores. Grace, then, is not a moral posture. It is a biological reordering toward coherence. Self-forgiveness feels wrong, because safety is new. One of the greatest misunderstandings in emotional healing is this. Self-forgiveness doesn't feel good at first. It feels unfamiliar, and the nervous system interprets unfamiliarity as danger, not freedom. There are three primary reasons for this. 1. The nervous system associates comfort with past patterns. If shame has been the organizing principle of identity, then compassion feels like identity loss. 2. Forgiveness removes the illusion of control. Punishment gives the brain a sense of order. If I suffer, balance is restored. Grace disrupts the equation and introduces uncertainty. 3. Compassion reopens vulnerability. If you soften toward yourself, you risk softening toward others, which can feel unsafe if relationships have historically been unpredictable. Self-forgiveness asks the body to re-enter relational openness, a state that may not have been safe in childhood. This is why compassion feels threatening, not soothing. Why the brain resists grace. Predictive coding and the error loop predictive coding theory in neuroscience explains much of this phenomenon. The brain is a prediction machine. Its primary goal is to minimize surprise. Shame is predictable, compassion is surprising. So the brain treats self-forgiveness as an error in its model. I don't deserve this. This doesn't match how I normally think. If I forgive myself, I'll repeat the mistake. If it hurt me before, it should hurt me now. These thoughts are not moral failures. They are predictive attempts to maintain equilibrium. But equilibrium is not always healthy. Sometimes equilibrium is just what the body knows. Compassion challenges the model and requires the brain to reorganize its expectations of safety, identity, and responsibility. This is an energetic cost, one that the brain initially tries to avoid. The invisible link between trauma and difficulty forgiving yourself trauma creates two subconscious rules. 1. I must monitor myself constantly. 2. If something goes wrong, I must tighten my control. Forgiveness directly contradicts both. This is why survivors often report feeling guilty for being gentle with themselves, feeling anxious when they relax, feeling unworthy of compassion, feeling suspicious of comfort, feeling compelled to relive mistakes, and feeling obligated to punish themselves internally. These are trauma responses, not personality traits. They emerge because the nervous system believes, if I lower my guard, bad things will happen. But grace is the process of lowering the guard without collapsing. It is the nervous system learning to live without its old armor. The digital mirror, why the internet makes forgiveness harder. Online spaces amplify shame-based predictability. Social media creates archives of every mistake, instant replay of past selves, constant comparison, public moral standards, unrelenting visibility, algorithmic reward for outrage, groupthink norms, fear of misinterpretation, performance pressure, perpetual self-surveillance. Forgiving yourself becomes harder when your past self is accessible in seconds. This is the digital paradox. We evolve, but our archives do not. These archives force us into a relationship with outdated versions of ourselves, triggering shame reflexes that the body would naturally have released over time. This is why scrolling through old posts triggers old emotional states. Your nervous system has not evolved a filter for context collapse. Forgiveness requires allowing the past to remain past. But online, the past is always now. Healing requires learning how to inhabit the present again, not the algorithmic echo of former selves. Collective compassion fatigue, and why the internet punishes grace. Digital culture tends to reward outrage, punishment, vigilance, and purity. Self-forgiveness disrupts the cycle. It introduces nuance in a context that benefits from simplicity. Forgiveness is slow. Outrage is fast. Nuance doesn't trend. Punishment goes viral. This is not our fault. It is the architecture of the platforms. We are not struggling with forgiveness because we are flawed. We are struggling because the environment we inhabit reinforces constant comparison, external judgment, fragmented attention, reactive communication, punitive moralism. Self-compassion becomes an act of resistance, a refusal to replicate the logic of the platforms inside your own nervous system. The real work of grace. Closing the space between the self you were and the self you're becoming. Self-forgiveness is not a moment. It's a bridge. It requires the following internal recognitions. 1. I did what I did because I was trying not to drown. Shame collapses context. Grace restores it. 2. I can understand my behavior without excusing harm. Forgiveness is clarity, not denial. 3. I'm allowed to evolve past what I once needed to survive. This is the core nervous system transformation. 4. The person I was then was not built to carry the weight I carry now. Compassion acknowledges capacity. 5. The past version of me was doing their best, and my best will continue to change. Evolution is the foundation of healing. The self that needs forgiveness is not the same self who is forgiving. This is why grace is possible. As deep as the psychological and neurological layers go, grace ultimately returns us to the body. Forgiveness is not fully complete when you understand it, only when you feel it. Understanding is cognitive. Release is somatic. Forgiveness is both. This is why element 4 turns toward the body's direct experience. Where the mind debates forgiveness, the body simply asks, can I breathe here? Can I soften here? Can I stay here? Can I trust myself here again? These questions cannot be answered intellectually, only physiologically. So now we move into the somatic landscape of forgiveness. Element 4, the somatic practice of letting go, interoception, micro-release, postural coherence, and the nervous system mechanics of emotional unwinding. Let your breath settle. Let your shoulders drop. We're stepping into the part of forgiveness that the mind cannot perform. Only the body can. Where release becomes a physical language, not a mental decision. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood human processes. People often speak of it as if it were a choice, a switch you flip, a virtue you earn. But that's the cognitive fantasy of release, the idea of forgiveness rather than the somatic reality of it. True letting go is not a thought. It is not a conclusion. It is not the moment you decide to stop hurting. It is a physical event, a shift in the nervous system that occurs when the body finally feels safe enough to loosen its grip around old pain. The mind narrates forgiveness, but the body performs it. In many cases, the body performs it reluctantly, because letting go is not only about peace, it is also about surrendering the tension that once kept you alive. This element is about that process, the embodied mechanism of release, the neurophysiology of emotional unwinding, the difference between mental understanding and somatic truth, and the quiet integrity of reclaiming your breath, posture, and presence after years of self-blame. The body speaks before the mind understands. Interoception, your internal sensing system, is the first language of emotional truth. Before a story forms, before you assign meaning, before words collect around an experience, the body has already reacted. It tightens, it contracts, it braces, it pulls inward, it reduces motion, voice, and breath. This is why letting go cannot be forced through self-talk or rational explanation. The body must first receive permission to stop defending, and that permission is physiological, not intellectual. Polyvagal theory describes this transition beautifully. Dorsal states hold collapse, shutdown, and internalized blame. Sympathetic states hold the mobilized energy of guilt, self-criticism, and hypervigilance. Ventral states hold the soft exhale of reconnection, the safety required for forgiveness. Letting go is not a cognitive skill. It is the body returning to ventral space after having been trapped elsewhere. That means you can understand your past fully and still be unable to release it. Understanding is a map. Release is a muscle. Emotion as incomplete movement. Somatic psychology has long emphasized the idea that emotion is not merely a feeling. It is a motion, a biological action that the body prepared but never completed. Grief is an urge to fold inward. Anger is an urge to move outward. Fear is an urge to mobilize or hide. Shame is an urge to collapse and protect the self from relational threat. When a child is punished, shamed, or overwhelmed, these action impulses are frequently interrupted. They freeze mid-cycle. They become held postures, neurological habits of safety. Letting go requires completion of what was once incomplete. Not intellectually, not morally, not philosophically, but physically. This is why someone can spend years working on themselves, journaling, analyzing, meditating, yet still feel something deep inside that refuses to shift. The body hasn't finished speaking. The movement is still stuck inside the gesture that never got to happen. Release is not about moving on. It is about moving through, allowing the body to finish a sentence it began decades ago. The physiology of release. When forgiveness becomes possible, several things happen in the body. 1. Breath deepens without being forced. The vagal brake softens. The diaphragm descends. Space returns to the chest. You stop performing calm and begin experiencing it. 2. Posture lifts from within. This is not sit up straight. It is the spine uncoiling from a fear posture. 3. Gaze softens. Eye contact becomes less about protection and monitoring, more about connection. 4. The throat unclenches. The most underestimated marker of self-forgiveness is the return of voice. Not its volume, its gentleness. 5. Micro movements resume, tiny shifts, sways, subtle gestures, the nervous system telling you it's safe to inhabit yourself again. These changes are so small that most people overlook them. But in somatic practice, they are the real evidence of release. Words might lie, mindsets might compensate, but the body does not fake regulation. Letting go is not letting them off the hook. One of the greatest obstacles to self-forgiveness and emotional release is confusion between justice and relief. Many people unconsciously hold on to pain because letting go feels like excusing harm, softening feels like self-betrayal, release feels like abandoning the younger self who suffered. Peace feels unearned because the nervous system is still braced for threat, punishment, self-directed or otherwise. Feels like loyalty to the past. But letting go is not the same thing as condoning what happened. You are not forgiving them. You are freeing yourself. Letting go does not rewrite the story. It rewrites the state the story lives in. The body steps out of the loop it has repeated for years, not to erase the past, but to stop reliving it as if it's still happening. This distinction matters. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without bracing. Why letting go feels dangerous. Trauma logic makes release feel unsafe for 3 reasons. 1. Pain has become a familiar companion. The nervous system prefers predictable discomfort over unfamiliar safety. Release feels like stepping into the unknown. 2. Self-blame keeps the world controllable. If it was my fault, maybe I can prevent it next time. Letting go means accepting that some things were never yours to manage. 3. Softness feels exposed. When someone grows up in environments where tenderness was exploited, The return of softness feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger. Thus, release requires relearning that openness does not always precede harm. Micro-practices for somatic release. These are subtle, embodied practices that help the body unwind self-blame and re-enter coherence. 1. The exhale of permission, not a deep breath, just a longer exhale. Extend it by a second. Feel the body loosen. Letting go begins with the exhale that says, I don't need to guard myself right now. 2. The shoulder drop. Imagine gravity doing the work. Allow the shoulders to melt rather than push down. This signals to the nervous system, the threat is over. 3. The gaze return. Look at something steady, non-intrusive, a candle flame, a tree, a point on the wall. Let your eyes unfreeze. When the eyes soften, the heart follows. 4. The micro tremor. If your hands shake, let them. If your body quivers, don't suppress it. This is stored tension completing itself. 5. The truth toucher. Place your hand on your sternum or the side of your rib cage. Notice the warmth of your own presence. Feel the body orient toward itself. Self-forgiveness begins with returning to the body as a place of safety. Why letting go cannot be done through the mind alone. Cognitive processing is essential, but it is not sufficient. Here's why. The prefrontal cortex cannot override subcortical survival patterns. Insight does not dissolve muscle memory. Rational clarity does not undo autonomic conditioning. Narratives cannot replace neuroception, your body's unconscious threat detection. Shame cannot be argued with, it must be soothed. This is why people often say, I know better, but I still feel this way. Knowing is not the problem. Your body just hasn't finished speaking. Letting go happens when the body finally stops rehearsing danger. The difference between mental release and somatic release. Mental release says, I'm done with this. Somatic release says, it's finally over. Mental release seeks closure. Somatic release discovers safety. Mental release is a choice. Somatic release is a moment. You can decide 1,000 times and never feel relief. You only need one moment of genuine safety for the body to let go. Forgiveness is not the decision. Forgiveness is the moment the body stops defending. Reharmonizing the nervous system through felt truth. Felt truth is an NSL principle that describes the shift from thinking safety to experiencing safety. You know you've reached felt truth when breathing becomes involuntary instead of effortful. The stomach unclenches. The heart rate slows. You stop monitoring yourself. Your voice softens without collapsing. Compassion appears without force. Your body no longer flinches at your own memories. Felt truth cannot be manufactured. It emerges when the nervous system realizes, the danger has passed. I don't need to hold this anymore. This is grace in its most literal form, a physiological reprieve. Digital mirror, somatic silence in an always-on world. One of the greatest obstacles to somatic release in the modern world is the constant pressure to express, explain, post, clarify, and narrate your internal state. Silence used to be natural. Now it feels radical. The nervous system requires periods of non-performance to recalibrate. But digital culture treats every moment of life as content, every emotion as a confession, every mistake as a public artifact. Letting go becomes harder when you are constantly reminded of your past selves. Your old emotional states are archived online. You feel watched even when you're alone. The pressure to update others overrides internal rest. You feel obligated to justify your healing publicly. You fear judgment for resting, softening, or changing course. Digital rest, the act of stepping back, stepping out, or stepping offline, is not avoidance. It is somatic hygiene. When the world stops asking you to speak, the body finally has space to release what it has been holding. The integrity of self-forgiveness often requires the courage to be unseen. Letting go is not an endpoint. It is an opening, a return to the body's original language, where breath, presence, and sensation guide the way before thoughts intervene. Now that we've explored release as a physiological event, in Element 5 we will examine how to integrate this shift into daily life, through conscious language, embodied practice, and a closing whisper that restores you to yourself. Overview of the integration frame. This element brings together the physiological, cognitive, and linguistic mechanisms explored throughout the episode, and translates them into a practical system for applying self-forgiveness and self-compassion in real time. The emphasis is on operationalizing grace, not as a mood, belief, or moral stand, but as a regulatory response pattern that shifts the nervous system out of self-surveillance and into internal stability. Across cognitive neuroscience, attachment psychology, and nervous system linguistics, 3 findings repeatedly emerge. 1. Self-compassion is a physiological shift before it becomes a cognitive decision. 2. Tone modulates threat detection faster than language content. 3. Self-forgiveness requires inhibiting punitive prediction loops and activating pathways linked to calm, presence, and coherence. What follows is an integration protocol modeled on these principles, a way to move the body, language, and attentional system out of punishment mode and into a reparative stance that supports long-term behavioral change. Nervous system language ritual. Pause, breath, receive, reroute. The NSL sequence used here is designed to interrupt the neurophysiological cascade associated with self-blame. This practice draws from polyvagal theory, attentional control research, and autonomic conditioning principles. Step 1. The pause is the disruption of automaticity. Self-blame becomes a conditioned reflex when the nervous system anticipates danger from internal or external evaluation. Pausing activates the prefrontal regulatory network and inhibits the habitual limbic response. Operationally, a pause lasts 3-5 seconds and includes cessation of verbal behavior, inner or outer speech, widening of the visual field, shifting from focal to peripheral awareness, cessation of physical fidgeting or pressure behaviors. This interrupts the threat cycle and begins a downshift in sympathetic arousal. Step 2. Breathe. Just one slow exhale shifts the autonomic profile. Research shows that controlled exhalation activates the ventral vagal pathway through the nucleus ambiguous, modulating heart rate and reducing defensiveness. NSL specifies: inhale for 2-3 seconds, exhale for 6-8 seconds, hold neutral for 1 second. Repeating this 3-5 times is sufficient to change the effective set point and cognitive accessibility of self-compassion. Step 3. Receive. Receiving is the least intuitive step, but the most important. It refers to allowing sensory and emotional data to be registered without cognitive interference. This step targets interoceptive awareness, insular activation, reduction of top-down defensive narratives, increased accuracy of emotional reading operational markers, noticing tension, heat, pressure, or collapse states, describing sensations neutrally, tight, warm, pressure, empty, inhibiting interpretive language, I'm failing, I'm slipping, etc. Receiving creates the necessary conditions for accurate emotional processing. Step 4. Reroute. Rerouting is the act of re-establishing psychological and physiological orientation. It shifts the system out of a disorganized state and into coherence. Methods include placing both feet evenly on the floor, lengthening the spine naturally, lowering the shoulders, engaging a steady, regulated tone. Rerouting signals safety internally and begins the process of updating the self-schema from punishment required to repair possible. Mirror talk drill. Hearing your tone with tenderness and recalibration. This drill targets vocal self-regulation, a documented mechanism for altering threat perception and enabling cognitive flexibility. Key functions. Tone acts as a carrier signal for safety or threat. The nervous system responds to tone more quickly than to semantic content. Self-directed voice modulation can change the emotional response to internal dialogue. Procedure 1. Record 10 seconds of your own neutral speech. Avoid emotionally charged content. A simple sentence is enough. I am taking a moment to check in. 2. Listen back without interpretation. Focus on pitch stability, pace, micropauses, muscularity of sound, tight, breathy, clipped. 3. Repeat the same sentence with a deliberate reduction in tension. Changes may include slower onset of speech, reduced pitch variability, and longer exhale before speaking. 4. Playback and compare autonomic responses. Listeners generally experience measurable shifts, decreased heart rate, reduced jaw tension, and slowing of cognitive loops. This practice recalibrates internal tone and decreases the system's reliance on punitive internal narration. Rewriting internal blame into language of repair. This section targets cognitive linguistic restructuring without relying on positive affirmation. Affirmations often fail because they bypass emotional realism and trigger internal resistance. Effective repair language must satisfy 3 criteria. 1. It must be physiologically believable. 2. It must maintain narrative continuity with past experiences. 3. It must avoid moral judgment and reframe behavior in terms of nervous system functioning. Examples of repair-oriented linguistic shifts, from I shouldn't have done that, to I understand why my nervous system reacted that way. From I always ruin things, to that behavior came from a survival pattern, not intentional harm. From I'm the problem, to I can examine this without attacking myself. From I need to fix myself immediately, to I can respond differently now that I'm calmer. These shifts reduce limbic activation and enable executive functioning to re-engage, facilitating genuine behavioral change rather than punitive looping. Reflection prompt. What becomes possible when I am no longer my own captor? This reflection question targets the internalized punitive model of self-relating. Many individuals maintain a high-threat stance toward themselves long after the external environment no longer requires it. Analytically, this question opens inquiry into behavioral freedom, creativity and problem-solving, emotional tolerance, interpersonal authenticity, and reduced hypervigilance. It also directs awareness toward the cost of self-enforced punishment and the potential gains of internal safety. Digital mirror. Realizing the performance of redemption digital behavior plays a significant role in shame maintenance and the difficulty of self-forgiveness. Here we address cybernetic loops of self-correction, audience-oriented cognition, behavioral overexposure, and algorithmic reinforcement of guilt states. A. Creating online boundaries that reflect self-forgiveness. This includes reducing unnecessary disclosure, resisting compulsive explanation, limiting engagement with self-critical content, and using digital breaks to allow cognitive defragmentation. B. Ending the cycle of public self-correction. Modern digital culture encourages hyper-accountability, often beyond proportion or necessity. These conditions lead individuals to constantly preempt criticism, reinforcing a state of self-surveillance. Releasing this requires decoupling identity from audience feedback, refusing to treat online opinion as moral authority, and reducing the frequency of justificatory posts. See, posting from presence, not penance. Presence-based posting emphasizes regulated tone, clarity of intent, absence of appeasement language, and reduction in compensatory communication. This practice conditions the nervous system to interact digitally from a state of coherence rather than fear. Returning to yourself here, the tone remains clinical, but softens slightly to facilitate closure. Self-forgiveness is not granted by external validation or retrospective moral evaluation. It is produced internally when the nervous system is no longer operating in a defensive state against itself. Grace becomes a form of internal stabilization, the re-establishment of physiological safety, cognitive clarity, and linguistic coherence. When the body is no longer bracing for internal punishment, emotional processing becomes more accurate, decision-making becomes less reactive, and behavioral repair becomes possible without coercion. Self-forgiveness is not erasure. It is integration, the act of acknowledging the past without allowing it to dictate future states. In the next episode, Integration and Authorship, Crafting Your Nervous System Vocabulary, we examine how to consciously build the internal and external vocabulary that supports long-term emotional regulation, embodied truth, and sustained relational clarity. You'll learn how to author the language your nervous system lives in. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, you've been listening to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. I'm James Miller.